Hey there, this video is for people that want to learn how to design effective interactive dashboards. We've got Ahmad Chami, the founder of D-Cubed Analytics. He is going to walk you through how to effectively design your dashboard, taking control of the report layout to tell your story, sharing his best tips and tricks that you should always follow, and also trying to steer you away from some pitfalls that you should avoid. It's a great session. It's pretty quick. I know you're going to love it. Please tell us what you think in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Enjoy.
Always happy to come back and contribute to the Maven community. It's where I started my data career, and it's since flourished over the last 5 years. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of the things I've learned along the way. Topic for our discussion today is going to be on designing exceptional interactive reports. And this is a presentation I've actually given a few times now at a few corporate clients. I saw a lot of really good feedback on it, and so I thought it would be a great opportunity to share some of the work with you all today. So a little bit about myself. My name is Ahmed. I am the founder and CEO of a data analytics firm, D-Cubed Analytics. I come from a healthcare background, so I've spent a number of years working in the public healthcare sector here in Canada, and I worked different areas, different agencies, up into the Ministry of Health for a number of years. And I also been doing the consulting thing along the side, and then have made that my full-time gig in the last 2 years. So I specialize in Power BI. I build reports. I do BI architecture. I do lots of training, and I teach at a few different institutions as well. So some of you I can see on the call here are familiar faces, familiar names. From some of my prior teachings. That's good to see you back here. And for those of you who are new to me, follow me on LinkedIn. I try to put out good content about Power BI, things I'm learning, things that are focused, I think are really relevant for analysts and developers. So give me a follow on LinkedIn, and send me a note as well. I'm always happy to hear from members of the community.
Awesome. Ahmed, I just dropped the link to your LinkedIn in the chat, so folks check that out and get it there.
Cool. So I've shown here just some of the clients that I've worked with. You can see a lot in the healthcare sector, a lot in the education sector, worked in oil and gas and energy as well. So smorgasbord, the Power BI consulting has provided me a really good platform to do a lot of really cool work across multiple industries and multiple clients. So the agenda for today, and I'm hoping that we'll spend about 40 minutes together where we go through the agenda items. We'll get through as many of the slides as we possibly can, doing them justice. And then we'll leave some opportunity at the very end to provide you all with an opportunity to chat with me, ask questions, bounce ideas. And if you don't get your questions answered then, or you want to follow up on something, shoot me a note. So the first thing we're going to talk about is developing with the end user in mind. So when it comes to designing effective dashboards, we want to be sure that it's effective and relevant for the end users that we are distributing the reports to. So understanding who's our audience and how to build for our audience. The next part is an area that I think now more and more people are in the Power BI/data space are becoming a little bit more in tune with, which is this term information architecture, which is this idea of organizing information in a layout, in a form that makes intuitive sense to the people who are engaging with that content, be it dashboards, reports, infographics, you name it. So I like to show this slide every time I do trainings, especially in the corporate sector, when I'm going into rooms where I have people who are technical people and I also have stakeholders in the room. I find this is a really good icebreaker because it kind of calls out the issue right from the beginning. So we in the technical space, all of us sort of wearing that technical data hat, we have a very different lens on data products or dashboards than maybe business partners do. So on our side, from a data perspective, we really care about data integrity, optimized ETL processes, consistency, efficiency. These are the kind of things that we gravitate towards. These are the things that we measure ourselves in terms of our success. Whereas from an end user perspective or a stakeholder perspective, they're looking at things from a different lens. They're looking at things that you might want to say, quote unquote, more subjective. So they want to interact with a dashboard that looks pretty, that's visually appealing, easy to understand, that's effective, gives them the information they're looking for. They don't have to click too much. They get what they need when they need it. And so we tend to get into this position, in a lot of corporate organizations where we start pointing fingers at each other. Data people aren't fast enough. They're not giving what we want. And then the data people look at the stakeholders or look at the business partners and say, well, they're not, following best practices. They're breaking rules. They're not, they're not doing it in an optimal way. And so we kind of find ourselves at odds a lot of times in organizations. And I don't think it needs to be that way. I think what we're doing is we're kind of looking at we're looking at one thing from different angles. We're both absolutely correct. From the developer standpoint, yes, you do have to have your backend built well. And from the business side, you do have to have a front end that's appeasing and nice to work with. This difference is what we call implicit versus explicit requirements. And I see a lot of developers and analysts, they get into this trap where they say, well, this is what the business asked me for. They didn't ask me for this other stuff. And so those front-end considerations are implicit. They're not necessarily asked for. The stakeholder or the audience is not going to sit there and say, I want a trend line, or at least they shouldn't be. Yeah, I want a trend line that's formatted in this way with some conditional formatting. Usually they leave it up to the developer or the analyst to decide. And so if we can get clarity and an appreciation for each of our lenses on this issue, we can have a much more harmonious relationship instead of having one that's full of animosity and bigotry and just not a healthy relationship to have in any organization. When we don't understand this, when we're not able to bridge the gap between these two very, very important areas of the business, we end up with data products or dashboards, which a lot of you are building, that get shelved, that no one ever uses. And that sort of furthers the chasm, it widens the chasm, because developers then kind of develop this sense of they're not appreciated. Their work is not valued by having their work being ignored and kind of shelved. Whereas the technical people or non-technical people become a little bit more skeptic, and they become less confident in working with data people because they don't really understand their needs. And so we desperately need to work on bridging that gap, because if we don't, we're investing a lot of money into data products that are just going to go get hosted in some server that no one will ever look at. And I think I kind of developed a little bit more of just a sense of urgency to this problem, because I work in a public healthcare system that's funded by taxpayers' money, right? We are all contributing to the healthcare system that at one point in our lives, whether we're born into the healthcare system, we get sick and we're using the healthcare system, or we die in a healthcare setting, at some point our lives or someone's life is going to be impacted by that system. And so you kind of develop this sense of we're spending lots of money and effort and energy into doing these things that are non-starters, that are just not giving us a good ROI. And so I made it my mission to sort of bridge this gap and make it so that when we're building data products, we're building things that will be used, that will actually lead to better decision making and better clinical, improvements in care that are given to our patients. But you can extrapolate this in any organization, right? The same things, it boils down to the same components. So when I put this up, we all kind of get into agreement. We all can learn how to share, hold hands and sing along and get along. The next piece I talk about is about priorities. Who does what? Because if we can't talk about who's responsible for what, it becomes really, really hard to manage each other. And I say manage in a way because we are managing our stakeholders in a sense. We are telling them how to be involved in the work, and our stakeholders are managing us. There's a sort of bi-directional relationship there, and that's something that if you're a Power BI geek like me, you'll appreciate. So when it comes to these responsibilities, I've divided up these things into two parts, because I believe strongly that the who, what, why, and when are very much the business of your non-technical users, your stakeholders. They very much get a say in who the audience is and telling you who you're developing the report for. They're telling you what the objectives are. They're telling you why the report is needed, and they are telling you when it's expected to be delivered. They very much are involved in that process. That's not scope creep. That's not someone too many cooks in the kitchen. That is exactly what they should be involving themselves in. However, you'll notice that I kind of removed how, because I believe strongly that the how is best determined by competent, strong technical expertise. How we develop, how we translate those requirements into technical builds is the responsibility of the developer, right? That if we can kind of learn to respect each other's responsibilities and roles in this, again, we're creating a much more harmonious, business that is really striving to drive data-driven decision making. So whenever I talk about designing effective data visualizations, you'll notice that we kind of got tagged to the category of data storytelling. I always see a lot of people in the room kind of get anxious, mostly data people, because they say, well, you know, Ahmed, I went to school, I went in kind of the technical sciences. I studied math and physics, and I kind of went in more of a computing science background. I'm not an artsy person, right? I didn't go into the creative area because I'm really better at computing sciences. This is sort of my domain. And so I like to show this visual. I actually borrowed it and simplified it from a book written by Donna M. Wong. I mentioned her book at the end of the slide, so you will get the slides, you can access that. But she puts this idea of, she maps sort of different types of data visualizations and tells you where they're at in that spectrum. And namely, dashboard, just the focus of what I do. You can see here, yes, it's visual, but it also is not as visual as, say, an infographic. So it's about striking a good balance of having good information, having data-rich content that's sort of creative, but not too creative. And if you find, and maybe we won't get to it today, but you'll find that this creative is actually more prescriptive than it is subjective, right? So there's guiding rules that say what to do and what not to do and how to treat certain data visualizations. Sorry, I got the keyboard too hard there. So when I'm starting to engage with the business and understanding, again, this is all going back to understanding our end user. I need to understand the why. Why are we doing this? And I really, spend a lot of time on this because I get to work with data leaders and training their data teams and working with their data teams. And one of the things that I find is that we often are committing ourselves too much, overextending our resources in data teams and promising the business on things that we can't deliver in a timely manner. And that sort of exacerbates that chasm between the technical and non-technical people. So I kind of come from a framework of, let's actually think about the business value. How is this contributing to the business? Not every data request is a dashboard, and we certainly shouldn't treat it in that way. And so we need to get clarity on what we're actually trying to achieve and why, because once we do so, we can start to prioritize certain data activities over others, which is a really, really important activity that data leaders and data teams need to master. And if they don't get this right, we have turnover. We have people leaving, unsatisfied, overworked, analysts and developers that are underappreciated and working twice as hard as the average person. And so we want to strike a good balance here. We want to have business clarity so that we know why we're building it. So if it comes down to, we have 10 requests right now sitting in the queue due at the end of the week, which of those requests are the more important ones? That's actually contributing to the business, back to the business. So in the healthcare sector, I'll just give that as an example. A lot of the times, one of the metrics that we can sort of measure business value is how is this contributing to the clinical care of a patient. Are we improving outcomes for them? Are we saving the system money and also improving outcomes? Those are the kind of things that we're looking at when we're determining the business value. So, I've written about this. You can visit my LinkedIn profile. You'll see that I've featured a number of articles that I've gone into detail about this. I'm just going to kind of touch on this. Normally, my philosophy with slides is that I'll kind of insert content that I won't necessarily read because I don't want to put yourselves to sleep. I don't want to put anyone to sleep, including myself. But here, really getting an understanding of what the goals are, it can really be really, really helpful when it comes to determining what's the best value for the team to commit their resources to. So these are the kind of questions that you go through that we ask, who's requesting that, who are the stakeholders? Really important to know who are the stakeholders because you need to keep those people involved. You need to keep them updated on the progress that you're doing your project. What's the business value? What's the objective? These are all really important things. Then it's really important to understand who's your audience, who are your viewers, how technical are they, right? Developing for example, a dashboard for an engineers, right? For engineers that are fairly technical and have a lot of experience dealing with complex concepts and data is very different from dealing with individuals that may not have such a technical background. Maybe they kind of have a different pursuit. So understanding who those audiences are, as well as who are your primary audience and who are your secondary audience. So oftentimes what will happen is executives will come to you and say, I need this because I want to improve X in the business. But they're not really the intended audience. They're benefiting this as a byproduct of their business users using it to improve business outcomes. And so that's why we really need to get clarity on who are we building for, because that's sort of alluding to the concept of a persona, understanding who our persona is and developing for that persona. The other thing I like here is, as well, is we want to understand how they're viewing this dashboard. I'll tell you kind of a funny story. I was hired recently to do some work where they commissioned me to sort of work on a 6-month project to build a suite of Power BI reports for them. Everything was going well. We went and deployed them. We put them up on Power BI service. And at no point did I think that I needed to ask, how are they going to be viewing the reports? Just didn't come to me. So I built these reports and I assumed they're going to be looking at on a laptop or a desktop. Turns out that these people who are viewing the reports were actually viewing it on their phone. And so when they viewed it on their phone, the interface was completely different. We had to go and scramble and rework a whole bunch of things to make it optimized for that viewing, for that display mode. So it's really important to get clarity on how they're actually going to be looking at it. And if they're going to be exporting to Excel, because maybe you need to prepare the visualizations in a certain way if they're going to be doing that. I love this quote by The Rock. He says, you've got to keep your finger on the pulse of what your audience is thinking, know what they'll accept from you. This is a really, really good skill to master as a developer, as an analyst, to know what will the business accept from you. You know, maybe they will accept some logarithmic, chart that has forecasting and predictive analytics in it. Maybe all they want is just a table that's formatted nicely that they can export to Excel. It's your job to figure out what they need and develop that, not necessarily to impose what you like and your flavor on things and try to get them to come along. You'll probably be fighting an uphill battle if you try to do that. So understanding your audiences, understanding your consumers and your end users is super important. We want to talk to them and now move to a more granular level. So once we've qualified the dashboard and say, we're going to commit to doing this because there's actual business value coming from it. Now we need to kind of gather requirements that are more specific. What are the KPIs that we're going to be using to measure X, Y, Z, right? I want to look at, wait times in an ER because I want to measure quality of care. I want to look at, patient survey scores to see how well are we delivering services in our different areas of the healthcare sector. We have to kind of talk about those key performance indicators, because you need that kind of clarity for you to take that away and say, yeah, the data can actually do that, or the data can't do that, right? So once we've gotten the what, part of that is also understanding, does the data that we have actually facilitate that? So many of you will know, and I know a lot of analysts and developers joke about this, but they say, our business users don't have realistic expectations of what our data can and cannot do. It's your job to actually tell them that and educate them on that. They're not expected to be experts in the data. That's why you are there. You're supposed to tell them, supposed to give them an idea in business language on whether the data that they have actually does what they need to do. And if they don't have data, it doesn't necessarily mean the road is closed, we're not going to work with you. It may mean we're going to work with you in a different kind of way. Let's go on an exploration to find data. Maybe we have the data in some database in our organization that we didn't really look into before. Maybe we need to capture data to be able to do this. It doesn't necessarily mean no, stop, we're not going to support. It just means we're going to support you in a different way than building you a dashboard or a report. So these things I write about it, again, you can read through this, but this is sort of my data assessment. The other piece that we developers and analysts, we avoid like the plague is as asking the business when they expect it by. We sort of make this assumption that the business is going to have unrealistic expectations and they're going to want something yesterday. And because of that, we don't ask this question, when do you need it by? Or if we do, we kind of get a vague answer. We really need to get clarity from the business on what their expectations are in terms of timelines, because if it's not realistic, we need to be able to push back and say, it's not realistic because of X, Y, Z. I'm a consultant, so I work in this space a lot. This is a constant conversation that I'm having with potential clients. I have a dashboard that I need tomorrow. And when you look at the data, you realize it's a 3-month project. But how do you do that without scaring off a potential client, and actually kind of diplomatically saying, well, it's not going to finish by tomorrow, because if we wanted to finish by tomorrow, you'd have to cut out all these things and you're going to incur technical debt and so on. You have to be able to kind of push back politely against the business and say, I don't think that's a realistic expectation. I think this is a more realistic expectation. And I found one of the tools that I use when I'm talking to clients is I actually try to show them the process at a very high level. Again, non-technical people, you don't want to get them down in the ETL processes and how you're going to use Power Query to do this, or how you're going to use your data modeling ninja skills to do X, Y, Z. They really just care at a high level, what are the big milestones that you're going to accomplish in the course of this project. And so I use this graphic here when I go into meetings with my stakeholders to say, we did this, and this is what's outstanding, because they need to be able to kind of see where you are at in the process to make sure you're moving along and you're not getting stuck. And in fact, if you do that, you can actually turn your stakeholders into allies, because if they can see that you're getting stuck in a certain area, maybe they can clear roadblocks, help facilitate you move along. So this is why it's really important not to strike that relationship of us versus them. It's more of a collective we. We are all working on the dashboard, and how we lend ourselves to the dashboard's development is very different. A data analyst or a BI analyst is going to tackle the project from a different lens than, say, a stakeholder, right? So when I kind of showed this balance here, when we let the stakeholders determine the when without input from the developers, we end up with really dissatisfied developers. And when we let the developers determine the timeline without as stakeholders, we end up with timelines that are just not realistic for the business. And so it's really important to talk through those things, because we can talk about scope a lot. We can reduce the scope if we really truly need it by tomorrow. Maybe there is some way we can give them what they need and significantly, drop down the scope and iterate on that product once we develop like a sort of low-hanging fruit. So it's really important to have this conversation, not to hide behind this. I find this is one of the most important areas to get clarity on. I include some resources here about some questions that you may use when you're engaging with a business. When you're conducting user research or stakeholder research, there's a few questions I'll have on my slide deck. I'll probably just skip over for now. But if you are looking for inspirational kind of questions that will get the juices, the creative juices of your stakeholders and end users actually going, there's some questions I've included in here as well as some resources at the end. This is a really great quote here. How well we communicate is not determined by how well we say things, but by how well we are understood. So you may be what you consider to be a very competent, very expert level developer, but if your business doesn't understand what you're doing, there's no value being added. Again, your dashboards are ending up in the dashboard graveyard. So these are the things that I was mentioning about some questions that can kind of help you move those conversations and have really, really good productive conversations with your stakeholders. I encourage you to read through this later. Yeah, take a look at it after. I think this quote really, this is where I want to sort of end this concept of the end user, understanding end users. It's really important not to try to interpret or try to speak over your end users or your stakeholders. It's really important to give them the room to let them speak. Because when you let them communicate what their goals are, later, if something comes up when you make a mistake, they can't blame you for not understanding, because they'll feel heard and they'll feel like you understood them. So you want to let people speak, let them get all their ideas out, and then it's your responsibility to sort of go through and sift through those ideas and actually figure out what you're going to do based on that. And I think some of you may be, sort of rolling your eyes. I can't say for sure, but I'm assuming there's a good proportion of you who are rolling your eyes and say, yeah, Ahmed, this sounds great, but in reality, we don't have the time to do this. And I think this is where I've been really, really, happy to be adding value to organizations, where we start having conversations about quality and quantity. It's not necessarily how many dashboards we can crank out this quarter. It's about how many dashboards we're going to crank out this quarter that are actually going to add value to the business. So maybe we do need to reduce the amount of work we're doing, but we focus the work on things that actually add value to the business. I think that that shift in the mindset is really important. Again, interviews and so on. This is a great question, a great one. If you don't know how to ask the right question, you discover nothing. And that's why I mentioned those questions. Really, really great, conversation starters. Because I find a lot of times analysts and developers will go into a meeting with a really important stakeholder and ask questions that are totally irrelevant and will kind of come off as you're wasting their time. Like, how is the weather? that might be a nice conversation to have over a cup of coffee, but not necessarily one to have in that form when you're trying to gather requirements from them. So I show this at the end of this because after you've heard a tool, then to come back to the business and say, I understood you, I know what you're talking about, here's how I communicate that back to you, is by using prototypes and wireframes. So you can create a visual, and this looks like a Power BI dashboard, but it's actually just a drawing that I sketched up in Figma. But when you go back to the business, you say, okay, here's what I understand from your requirements, and here's what I think the dashboard should look like. The reason why I do that is because we can come to really concrete agreement on what the scope of the build is. We've developed things and written code against things, we get really crystal clear about what they're asking now. And here it's just more examples of different prototypes and wireframes that I developed along the way for different clients. So getting really clear with them on what their ask is so that you can get clarity before you start to build. Okay. So moving on to our next topic, and we have about 15 minutes left. I know I'm seeing things blow up in the chat, so we'll get to those at some point. But I wanted to get through the next part, which is informational architecture, right? So now we assume that you really do understand your users. You're coming in with a list of requirements. How do you actually build a dashboard for those requirements? That's the part of the information architecture. So I believe fundamentally that you have to sort of get three things right. You have to get the structure of your report in a functionally hierarchical way. You need to have functionally organized page layouts, and you also need to have action-oriented visualizations. So an exceptional interactive report follows those three components. It gets those three components right. Your dashboard moving from one page to another makes sense. It's coherent. You can understand that you're going from high-level information down to more granular information. For example, the information you have organized, the visualizations you have organized on the page are organized in such a way that facilitate easy interaction with them. Now, I kind of just throw out a question here. How many of you have ever had to sit through training on how to use Amazon to order something? No one, right? Amazon makes it almost, one might say like stupid proof that you can understand their interface with little to no, orientation on how to use the interface. That's to me the goal that we're striving for. Your dashboard should be that simple. Similar to someone going and buying something online, they should be able to know how to interact with your dashboard. And then you should have really good visualizations because you don't have a lot of space. You have a very limited space to communicate the information you need to, and so using the right kind of visualization to communicate that data is also really, really crucial. So this sort of follows the Schneiderman's visual information seeking mantra, and I'll actually kind of give a shout out to an article that was written by Kurt Buehler on the 330 and 300 rule on SQL BI's website. Go ahead and check that out because it kind of dives into this concept a little bit more. But we look at this framework as overview first, zoom and filter, then details on demand. And so when we're designing a dashboard, we want to make sure we sort of follow that rule in the order that we mention it. Have an overview, have a zoom and filter view, and then have details on demand. So when I say thinking about the report layout, this is literally how I plan my dashboards. I start sketching it out in PowerPoint, in Figma, maybe in my sketchbook. I start to plan out the different pages. So I know, for example, I have an overview page. This maybe will be accessed by executives who are looking at a high level. What are the different metrics that they have? I like to call this your thermometer because here they're going to look at your KPIs and they're going to say, do I need to intervene? As an executive, do I need to get involved here? Is something routinely popping up in the red? Do I need to be involved? Then you have dedicated pages. I like to think of it as for every KPI you have in your overview page, you should have a dedicated page to zoom in and filter. So let's say you have 3 KPIs, you should have 3 pages, one for each KPI to slice and dice that data, to be able to interact with that data in a more deep level. And then the details on demands are drill through pages. So maybe we want to look at this detail from the concept, from the perspective of a client or a project manager or an individual, or maybe we want to hover over certain visuals and have tooltips. Those are sort of, dynamically sought after if someone is actually after that really detailed information. This approach actually follows something we call the guided analytics approach. And if you're curious, I would actually encourage you to go read about this as well. It's something I found fascinating, which is understanding how to guide your end users through your data products. So in order to understand how to do that, you need to understand how their mental model is. How do they process information? Because if you understand how your end users process information and the succession of the steps that they get to their information, you can then design more intuitive dashboards. I'll give you a little story here, kind of joke around a little bit, but I think this is really important to kind of illustrate this concept. I am a dad of 3 young kids. You know, nights are tumultuous. I owe my wife a lot for, managing the young ones at night and allowing me to sleep so I can work during the day. But we tag team, right? And so one of the things that I do is I get the kids ready for school in the morning, right? I get them off. And so in order to be a functional human being in the morning, waking up at like 5 and getting the day started and feeding the kids and getting them dressed and off to school, I need a good cup of coffee, right? So for me, the way I get my good cup of coffee, and I get it really fast because I don't have a lot of time. I'm running, taking kids to the bathroom, getting them changed. Someone wet the bed, something happened, unexplained, some weird circumstances. I need to have a good cup of coffee fast, and I want it to be reliably good. So for me, I solve that problem by buying myself an espresso machine. Put the pod, turn it on, I get my cup of coffee. Don't need to, do too much work. I get a good cup of coffee and it's consistent day in and day out. Let's say someone comes to me, some developer, some analyst comes to me and says, "Hey, Ahmed, I don't know why you're having that cup of coffee. Let me give you this coffee machine. It's an Italian espresso machine. They make the best coffee." I know I'm starting some controversial thing right now, but let's assume they make the best superb coffee. They really know how to make their espresso. What do you need with all this Nespresso stuff? Let me actually give you the real stuff. So I'm going to buy you like the $600, fancy espresso Italian machine that you can grind your beans and then make your coffee and you'll have the best coffee. For me, that doesn't work. It's not a solution. Although it's giving me better coffee, arguably it's giving me better coffee. But for me, that's not a solution because that involves me having to take away time that I don't have. And so a lot of the times we tackle data problems in our organizations in the same way. We tell the business, this is the best way, but it may not necessarily be the best way for them. You have to look at the circumstances in which you're operating to make sure that the data product or the suggestions that you offer the business actually make sense given the circumstances. So that's kind of the understanding of how to connect the mental models to then organizing the page. So this visual here really captures it, but this is, again, you have your executive summary, focus pages, and then detailed reports on demand. I guess I had a duplicate slide. So once you then think about how you're going to structure the information in the dashboard, I know I'm going from this page to this page to this page. The next one is then to organize information within that page. And so I'm a Power BI guy, but I can credit the enemy from time to time. Tableau actually has some really good resources on research that they did on eye tracking technology. They had a conference where they brought a whole bunch of people, showed them a bunch of dashboards on the wall, and they put eye trackers on to see where they looked on the dashboard. And then they aggregated that data and summarized it in something that looks like this. So they brought up this dashboard, and as you can see here, users, the areas that are appearing in white are where the users were actually looking most. As you can see, there's definitely a bias for information that's on the top of the page and sort of the middle section of the page. Notice how information on the bottom and the right-hand side really don't get a lot of attention. And so if you know that your users are probably going to ignore the information that's on the bottom part of the page, don't put any really important information there. You want to structure the information on the page in a way that you know will get the most attention and focus from your users. Here's another visual, again, eye tracking technology. As you can see here, the areas that are getting a lot of, like it's lighting up in color, is because there's a lot of engagement on that content. People's eyes are gravitating towards it. Notice once again, a lot in the top middle section, less on the bottom right section in the bottom part of the page. So if you know that, you can sort of build your dashboards to have information on the page that's really easy to understand right in the front of the page, top of the page, and then build more detailed visuals on the bottom where people will only go look there if you really, really need to get to that granular level. So how I translate that is I kind of organize my pages, my dashboards in this way. I structure so that I have my slicers in this area, because I know if I want to place slicers that they're going to interact with, they'll notice them if I put them here. I build my top visuals, my sort of high KPIs here, and I have information about this page up here. Less so, I'm using these areas that are in white because they don't really get a lot of attention, so I don't want to put any vital information there. That kind of gives you an idea of how to organize the page. The last one is now using images, using data visualizations. And using data visualizations is actually really, really important. So studies have been shown that were conducted with a number of different people, where they showed that if you show people information in pictures, they will recall that information much more. They will understand that information far more, and they will actually read that information, and more importantly, act on that information at a higher proportion. And so if you know that visualizations can be a very powerful tool, you want to make sure that you're using visualizations to tell your story. I know a lot of the finance people in the room here, and FP&A people are probably kind of, again, crossing their arms and saying, don't take away my Excel sheets from me. I'm not saying we do that, but I think there's also a merit to having really good visualizations to communicate the information that may be in a tabular format. Keep your tables, but also design effective visualizations. So Edward Tufte, many of you will be familiar with his name. He's sort of the forefather, the modern forefather, who's become more of a controversial, figure of late. But he wrote extensively about, best practices for formatting data visualizations. A lot of his work was in the 80s. It's slightly outdated if you read his books right now, in my opinion. But his student, Donna Wong, I include her book at the end of this lecture, but she sort of revisited a lot of those concepts in a more modern way. So I encourage you to pick up her book. But he kind of outlines how to design a friendly data graphic, how to design a data graphic or a data visualization that's approachable, easy to be understood. So when I'm building my visuals, I want to make sure I'm following some of these best practices. Now, I'm all for best practices, but I also think there's always a time and place to break those best practices. There's always a time and place to deviate from what is considered the best practice, because ultimately, your audience is what determines what you develop. So if your audience wants something that completely breaks all the rules, but that's what makes sense to them, you give them what you want. You don't insist on giving them best practice. We can leverage these concepts of pre-attentive attributes. I don't have a lot of time to go into these things, but I wanted to show you a couple examples. Here you can see on this side, I have a nice table of information. As you can see, this is, I referenced the book here. I'm blanking on the name of the book right now, but I referenced these visuals were from that book. But as you can see here, if I was to ask you, go down this list and tell me which state has the lowest per capita drugs and non-durable copay, you would take you some time to find that information. But if I used a pre-attentive attribute like color to highlight that information, you can find it very, very easy. So you may still want to use your tabular visualizations, but by using visual cues, you can draw people's attention to the most important information in those tables, instead of them having to find that information, kind of play Sherlock Holmes in your dashboards. Yep, I'm not going to delve into this. I wanted to show you one more example here. This was some data set that I was working with, and I wanted to show people here. We're looking at emergency response times for different ambulance stations. And if I asked you here, which of the stations here has the highest response time to get to a scene where they need to intervene, you're going to have to spend some time trying to figure out what column I'm actually looking at, and then in that column, which row am I focused on? Whereas if I used visualizations and told you that this is the value, and I used visualizations to show that by sorting the information in the right way, by using visual cues to demonstrate that information, I can easily get to that information much faster than I would if I just left a blank table to, have my stakeholders try to decipher and figure out how to get to the information they need. So I will end it here. I think we're right on time, but I wanted to, if this topic really interests you as much as it does for me, I would highly encourage you to pick up these two books. The one on the left is the one by Donna M. Wong. I told you she's a student of Edward Tufte. Really good book for best practices on formatting data visualizations. And then the book on the right is a bit thicker by Stephen Few. He's written a number of books, but this book here, Information Dashboard Design, is really good at giving you a deep dive in some of the concepts that we talked about. So if you walk away today, pick up those books and further reading. And without further ado, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And I open it up to John to facilitate the questions and to, yeah, back to you.
Amazing. Ahmed, this was so good. I think what you did an amazing job of like nailing some concepts at, you know, the super high level. And then, but you also backed it up with some really concrete details that I think people, you know, audience, what do you think? I'd love to hear from you in the chat. Do you have something that you can take away from here that is going to immediately make you better at building dashboards? I feel like everybody's going to say yes. Like I have 10 things. It was a really, really good presentation.
Awesome.
I love the heat maps that you put together. People were really lighting up just like the heat map. So that was super cool. So let's get into some of the audience Q&A if you don't mind sitting in the hot seat for a little bit. So
let's do it.
Hey there, hope you're enjoying the video. Sorry to interrupt, we'll get you right back to it. Right now, Maven Analytics is offering a deal that was just too big not to share it with you. We've got an early Black Friday sale, and you can save up to 50% off of Maven Analytics paid plans. So if you've been considering learning Excel, SQL, Power BI, Python, Tableau, and everything else that you need to become a data analyst or accelerate your career, now is the perfect time. Check it out at mavenanalytics.io. You can see the Black Friday offer in the banner at the top of the screen. You can't miss it. Again, if you're on the fence, there's never been a better time. We don't do a lot of these sales, so I hope that some people will take advantage. Now, enjoy the video. I'll let you get back to it. Thanks. All right, so this one's from Mohammed here. How do you determine which KPIs or metrics to prioritize in an interactive dashboard so that you avoid overwhelming users with too much information? Like, how do you pick? You showed sort of the top left is the most important area.
Yeah.
How do you pick what goes there usually?
Yeah, I kind of let the business decide, right? So I very much involve them in trying to understand what are those most important KPIs. You know, there are some things that people kind of track that we call them kind of like vanity KPIs. They're there because it looks nice on a graph. I try to get to the bottom of like what actually matters. When you're tracking this, what is the most important piece that you want to track here? And then I determine on how to organize the information on the page. And I'm also, again, sometimes what happens is through these conversations, I find that they actually are trying to measure a bunch of different topics. And so what I do is I'm not, you know, opposed to maybe creating two dashboards. Maybe it makes sense to separate them out and not have to cram everything in one dashboard. You know, so in Power BI, you have the ability to create apps where you have multiple reports in one environment. That can be a really good solution to say, instead of trying to cram everything into one page or one report that, you know, maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense to do so.
Awesome. I love it. I mean, I think that's, you said a really important thing to start it off is let the business decide, right? Like that's, you know, think of us as we're a vehicle for the information to get to the business, you know, and that's whatever they need. So I love all the detail there too. How about this one? This is from Daria. Do you always ask for feedback from stakeholders in regards to the quality or content of your dashboards? So like how much of it is a back and forth when you're putting together a dashboard for somebody? Do you mock it up, show it to them, or is it usually like a finished product by the time you show it to them?
No, I am a strong believer in getting the mock-ups to them as fast as possible and being really like using that as the conversation to make sure we're super clear on what we're going to build. I've had to do this, so that maybe more so than some other people, because in the consulting space, you know, we often get thrown curveballs right at the end of the project when you're kind of tight on budget, tight on timelines. And so to avoid that, I get right up front to make sure that we're super clear on the specific thing that we're building. And then we only proceed to do development once we have clarity on that. Now, if they come back to us later and they say, well, we didn't ask for that, I also have something to go to them and say, actually, you did. So it's kind of a nice way, of a polite way of also kind of holding them to account to make sure we're actually building, again, like what they commissioned us to do, and not necessarily, you know, pivoting so much and going through a bunch of change requests all right before the deadline. It's not helpful for the developers, and the business is not going to like it as well.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. You know, it's got to be a conversation And the earlier you can make it a conversation, the less work you'll have to do reworking something that wasn't what they wanted. So like getting that up front is really smart. You know, I'll even, before I design something, I would even ask, you know, hey, Cindy, I think these are the metrics you care about, like revenue and the efficiency of the call center. Am I right? Or like, is there something that I was missing? And even before I like touch data at all, I'm usually asking those questions. And I think that's I think that's a really smart move. Here's one that's sort of tool specific. This is from Sharif. How can I choose whether to use Tableau or Power BI? Which one should I learn if shifting into a data analytics career? I hear this one all the time.
It's a good, I think it really depends on where you're, like what area of the business you're in, what they're using, what your specific, you know, I'll share a personal example. So in healthcare, Power BI was much more prevalent than say the use of Tableau, and because of the enterprise licenses, there was a little bit of a better like rates that they had with the Power BI stuff. But that again was very specific to the industry I was working in. In other industries, like I know for some people I've worked in the education sector, they use mostly Tableau here in Canada at least. So it's kind of figuring out where you hope to land, and then also being able to, like, you know, have that understanding. I think that's what, you know, the power of having conversations and sort of being explorative when you're looking for a job, not just, you know, flash applying to everything. You really get a sense of what the industry is looking for and make yourself, you know, useful in that way. So, yeah,
that's fantastic. Here's another good one that I'd love to talk about. So how do we ensure accessibility of dashboards, making them usable for individuals with different abilities? And so one example that jumps out to me is I worked with somebody who was colorblind, and I didn't know he was colorblind until I made a presentation to our board meeting. And he's like, dude, you're killing me. I just saw a bunch of the same thing and you're talking about colors. And that's how I found out he was colorblind. And then I started thinking about it differently. But do you think about that? Are there other things that you think about in terms of accessibility?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know, you know, I guess it didn't make its way into the slide deck this time, but that's a huge, huge topic. And I think a lot more is being written about it more like now. I would say in specific Power BI things, I would look out for specific things, gotchas. So, you know, in Power BI, we sometimes will use those icons for conditional formatting, like those red, yellow, and green balls. For someone who's colorblind, I mean, completely colorblind, they see no difference between those icons. So I would encourage you to use icons that are a little bit more, you know, clear on what they're actually showing. So maybe a check mark, even if they can't see that check mark is green, they will still see the shape, and that will indicate to them that that something is good. Another thing to also take into account just as a rule of thumb is you want to make sure that you get contrasting right, contrasting colors. So a tip that I share for developers is, once you've done your report, if you want to see if it's accessible to someone who's let's assume the worst, you know, completely grayscale, print out your dashboard in black and white or in grayscale. If you can differentiate between the elements on the page, it means you have a good enough contrast between the colors that it probably will be visible. If not, then maybe go back to the drawing board. And I would also say, like, if you have members in the organization that, you know, maybe they can lend themselves to some user testing, involve them and get some feedback from them to see whether it's actually making sense. So I've kind of got lucky because I have a developer on my team that I work with who's colorblind, completely colorblind, like the worst type of colorblindness. And so I'll run things by him, be like, what do you think? So if I get the pass from him, I usually know I'm good to go. If not, we go back and we revisit things.
I love it. Awesome. I love it. I love the question. Thank you for asking it. Ahmed, we're at time. Like I said, you were amazing. Folks, give some love to Ahmed right now. This was an awesome session. Thank you so much, my friend. Like I said, you're one of my favorite people in data, and you rocked this. You did such a good job for the audience. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you tuning in. Take care.
Hey there. I hope you enjoyed this video. This was part of our Open Campus event where we ran 24 sessions in front of a live audience over the course of 2 weeks. It was a ton of fun. We did all these live sessions and we opened up our entire learning platform for free. You did not need a paid account to take advantage of all the courses. So folks could learn Excel, SQL, Power BI, Tableau, Python, etc. All the stuff that you need to learn data analysis skills and take your career to the next level. If you missed it this year, keep an eye out. We'll definitely be doing this again next year, probably again in October. We would love to see you there. And the last thing that I'll leave you with, if you're looking to take your skills to the next level right now and you've been on the fence about a Maven Analytics paid plan, we are currently running our early Black Friday sale. This is the absolute best time to pay for Maven Analytics if you want to, so don't miss out. You'll have the opportunity to save up to 50% on paid plans, which is a pretty great opportunity. You can check out all the details at mavenanalytics.io. Just look for the early Black Friday banner at the top of the site. You can't miss it. Hope that we'll see some of you there as well. Thanks for watching.